I'm Connor Wold, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s. And this week we're going to be looking at my picks from 6 to 2 of the top 10 sci-fi fantasy movies of the decade. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I give my opinions on what are some of the best movies of the decade. Essentially how the series works is every 3 weeks there's a new genre, and I break down in 3 different videos my picks of my top 10 favorite movies of the decade in a specific genre. Of course, we're in sci-fi fantasy right now, but I've already done action and romance, so you can check out those videos. The first video is my 10 to 7 picks. The next video will be 6 to 2, and then I do a final episode on my favorite romance movie of the decade. And next week is going to be my favorite sci-fi fantasy movie of the decade. But jumping into my picks here for my 6 to 2, no honorable mentions, just the list. My number 6 is Tomorrowland.
You ain't seen nothing yet. Hang on.
One of the most underappreciated movies of the decade, one that was sort of seen as this big commercial bomb, but I think is actually a huge artistic achievement, a stone-cold sci-fi epic, unlike anything in this genre in this decade. In a time where franchises, and especially in sci-fi, are sort of dominating the popular consciousness, this movie was something different. It promised this idea of a world, of a new matrix of Star Wars, but in a lot of ways that was its downfall. I think a lot of people at the time were built up with these expectations, some great trailers, this sort of promise of this interesting place, of this Tomorrowland. It's going to be a new Star Wars, it's going to be a new Matrix, even though that's not necessarily what the movie actually was and what we got. And I think, you always try to do your best to remove yourself from expectations of hype, of anything like that, and try to really judge and critically evaluate the movie just for the movie itself. And I think that's where a lot of people sort of went astray with this movie. But I didn't see it in the theaters. I saw it for the first time at home, and it was really blown away when I first saw it. So much so that it actually inspired me to start my short-lived podcast series, Connor the Contrarian. If you don't know, I did about 10 or so episodes about movies that I liked that the critics didn't. It was a podcast, and the first episode was Tomorrowland. So if you want to hear more of my in-depth thoughts, I guess, about that, check out it on the YouTube channel. It's just the audio, but you can listen to it there. But even though the marketing and what we all thought would be this promise of this new world was actually what the film was. The film is actually a road movie to Tomorrowland. The movie itself, in a lot of ways, is promising a new world. It is myth building, but what that's sort of been known for in terms of the J.J. Abrams sort of style of building up stories but not being able to end them, I actually think uses that sort of storytelling device in an interesting way. Similar to other sort of maybe action movies where you hear about John Wick before you see him, or even something like Harry Lime in the Third Man. You always hear about him, and then when you finally see him, you already know so much about them that you already have this almost pre-carried baggage towards it. And that's what Tomorrowland is about, a girl who's approached by another young girl who's actually discovered to be a robot, who tells her, okay, you're going to potentially save the world, you need to come with me, and they sort of go on this trip, and certain elements of Tomorrowland and the history of Tomorrowland and sort of the mystery of it is all throughout the film, and sort of uses that as a propelling device, that it's really a road movie getting to Tomorrowland. Just talking about Tomorrowland, sort of adventure of actually getting back to a place that was now closed, and why was it closed, and sort of asking these questions is just a smart way to propel the story and keep us engaged and keep it that mystery element. And I think the story works for that reason, because I don't want to spoil it, but when we sort of realize what's happened and near the end of the film, it really sort of, I think, accentuates the themes of the film. I think it has a sort of maybe, that this world, Tomorrowland is this world where all the great sort of scientists and people went without any sort of restrictions, and what went wrong, almost Bioshock as libertarian, Randian kind of a fantasy in a certain way, which Brad Bird, I think, has sort of been maybe lumped into, maybe rightfully so, maybe not so. I sort of get that vibe from his movies, and I think that's just, in general, just a really sort of fascinating concept and a sort of political theory, we'll call it, and something that he tries to explore and tries to sort of confront head on by instead making this world, Tomorrowland, a world that has already existed. We're not in the sort of Tomorrowland as of now. The film isn't taking place all in Tomorrowland. It's about that, the past, it's set in the future, but it's really about the past of this time of Tomorrowland, of this sort of utopia, we'll call it, that, we went somewhere, we don't know what happened, they sort of closed it off, and that's sort of, like I said, the mystery of the film. But when the story moment is revealed, it really sort of accentuates a lot of the themes of the movie, which aren't tackled in some other science fiction movies, themes of optimism, of pessimism, of what's right for you versus what's right for everyone, what's the right thing to do, or what's the sort of maybe selfish or selfless thing to do. I think there's some of those themes that are without this movie that are really related to me and really allowed me to intellectualize and sort of relate to it on that level in some of the larger themes, but also sort of keep that mystery and that intrigue to keep me propelled. And then, throughout the journey, it's very sort of maybe 80s Spielbergian action, we'll call it, which is just another way of saying suburban kid relationship where there's clear and effective action with a moving camera. There's great kid actors, a good grumpy George Clooney. The ensemble as a whole really sort of impressed me, and I think Tomorrowland works on the sort of grand level of, we talked about in last episode that sci-fi a lot of times allows us to reflect back on society and either difficult issues, politics, religion, race relations, things like that are often displayed in sci-fi because they have a filter, which is there for a lot of people sort of easier to digest. So in a way, I think Tomorrowland looks at that in terms of your perspective and your look on life. It sort of has these larger themes, but very few of those movies that also have those larger themes, which are intellectually challenging, are as entertaining or as action-packed or as just fun of an adventure as this movie is. So it has both of them. I think it's really underappreciated. It's just a movie that flies by really quickly, and I could see where you'd be sort of maybe upset at the ending, but I think that actually just why I appreciate the movie and why I connect to the movie and why I keep coming back to the movie and why the sort of images are so resonant within my head. Then my number 5 pick is Ex Machina.
Nathan, he isn't your friend. We're wrong.
Wrong about what?
Everything. Do you want to be with me?
Can we talk about the lies you've been spinning me?
What lies?
You have to help me. What will happen to me if I fail your test?
A movie I've been drawn back to ever since I saw it back in 2015, and one of the most watched movies I've probably seen on this list. About a programmer who wins a contest to be part of a test with the sort of genius CEO founder of this mysterious big tech company, and he soon realizes that the test he must do is to try to see if this artificial intelligence and this robot that the CEO founder boy genius has created is actually something that is human, that passes the Turing test, which means that the person who's testing doesn't realize that the robot, it seems as to be a human. This is really one of the most sophisticated movies in terms of every single piece of direction, everything that's in the frame, how lean the movie is. I never feel like there's something that could be cut out, how everything sort of adds up to something in the end. It's incredibly smart written dialogue, rich with dual meaning and subtext, the sort of restrictive movements of the camera, framing, allow on these sort of longer shots, and just building a really beautifully paced, tense kind of a thriller, but really sort of anchored by these three actors and their characters and what they're able to get out of them, and what Alex Garland, the writer-director, is able to get out of their performances. And really, this was having these three guys, these people at the sort of brink of stardom, we'll say. After this movie, Donald Gleason and Oscar Isaac go on to be in the next 3 Star Wars movies. Alicia Vikander wins an Oscar, so they really had sort of great success after this movie. I think this movie definitely kind of launched them into stardom. Of course, you have Donald Gleason, played by Caleb, who is always sort of weary because he's on this house with this CEO by himself and this robot, and they're completely isolated. He has to take a helicopter to be here. He's already sort of this reclusive figure. So Caleb, played by Donald Gleason, playing at this sort of traditional tech kind of dweebish, but still intellectual and smart, but maybe has a lot of these thoughts but doesn't get challenged with them a lot. Has these constant sort of intellectual chess battles with Oscar Isaac's character Nathan, who Oscar Isaac, he's probably my favorite performance in this movie. But that being said, they all sort of perform a different role, but his character specifically as Nathan and what he's able to bring out of it, where the words will say something, but you very clearly sort of obviously, or maybe not so obviously, especially, or you understand after second and third viewings what he's actually saying, that he'll say one line but then say something else with a glance. It's sort of that dual meaning, and works really well as there's these often sort of intellectual colored dialogues or word-driven chess matches of what's human, and sort of having these conversations, but also these conversations of where Nathan is clearly trying to, or at least playing with the idea of sort of scaring Caleb a bit, sort of being welcoming, but also having this sort of odd edge. And every time you think that Caleb maybe has got the best of him, you now realize maybe later on in the movie that actually he hasn't, or that he always sort of wins an argument because he just sort of, you can tell he has this sort of superior intellect, but then tries to dumb it down in an attempt to be sort of almost relatable. And then of course Alicia Vikander as Ava, as this sort of curious robot. She excels because I think at the beginning of the movie she plays a robot, so she has to sort of be stale and sort of robotic in her actions and her movements, but at the beginning she's very open with her feelings and in terms of communicating them, but her face is much harder to read. But then as the sort of film progresses, I start to feel that to be a little bit reversed, that her words now are becoming a little bit more mysterious and a little bit more vague, but her face is maybe saying something different, that given sort of new information and given sort of the dialogue she has between the dialogue between Ava and Caleb, the film of course progresses, and feelings and opinions and thoughts you maybe previously had change. So there's sort of this interesting progression where she actually does both sides. Alicia Vikander does both sides, where she has this sort of robotic, mysterious, almost kind of face where she's not giving us anything because she's so sort of devoid of any emotion, but her words are telling us, I'm feeling happy, I'm sad. But then later on, she sort of, her words become, and her feelings become a little bit more vague in terms of what she's saying, but we see very much so her on her face and what she's able to express that way. So combine these 3 brilliant performances with amazingly written characters, this constant sort of intellectual chess battle, talking about some of these themes while also being a really tight thriller, and interesting that you watch it one way the first time, you watch it another way the second time, another way the third time, and you get all these different viewpoints, different perspectives. And like any great movie, you catch up on little different things and pieces of dialogue, themes that are explored, knowing the end and then going back to it. Just a really entertaining movie with, I think, maybe the most sophisticated and most thoughtful confrontation of AI and artificial intelligence and the future of how that's going to impact our society. Then my number 4 pick is Interstellar.
We must confront the reality of interstellar travel.
Murph, I love you. Forever. I'm coming back.
One of the best filmmakers of the 21st century, Christopher Nolan, delivers his space epic in this decade. A film about saving humanity in a post-apocalyptic future where all hope is lost, where there's one final chance to look to the stars to try to save our world down here. Now, I think a lot of people connect to Christopher Nolan films, the reason why they do so well at the box office, the reason why they get nominated for lots of Oscars and whatnot, is because he's sort of tapped into something that is both entertaining, but I think really rewarding as a viewer. And I think that for a lot of people, they sort of relate to, and I think the most obvious elements of his films, which are sort of the complex storytelling, the different cross-cutting, intercutting, the different layers upon layers, these sort of multiple different characters and sort of grand sweeping stories that he's able to pull off. But also I think that if you're a fan of his movies, you appreciate that, but you also are coming back to the emotional connection with the film. That it's not, I think if you don't connect with his films, you appreciate that sort of type of storytelling, but you're not connecting to the emotional sort of heart of the movie. But if you do connect to the emotional heart of the movie, which like I do, I think that becomes even more of an emotionally rewarding and just a complete rewarding cinematic experience. And I think Interstellar may be his most emotionally impactful movie for me. But that sort of storytelling aspect, that's what he does in this movie that's different than other movies, is of course playing with the idea of time, that once you go through interstellar travel, you're going to change the way relativity and how we sort of perceive and interpret time, so that there's an incredible amount of stakes where not only is this the saving humanity, this really feels like the last chance, the world is bleak, it's grim, and this is the final opportunity we have. Not only that, but now every decision you make, every time you argue, every second, therefore leads to a month or an hour or a year, depending on how far you go, and how time for you and what you experience it is different than what time is in other periods, which is sort of a heady kind of concept that is hard to wrap your head around, but I think Christopher Nolan actually does a good job explaining it and making you understand it, so that when he's able to sort of pay off the moments, these sort of tense moments, that not only is it the biggest stakes of any Christopher Nolan movie, it's the biggest stakes in the world, it's the end of humanity, but also there's all this time where not only are you running out of time because you only have 2 hours to do something, it's like, no, you're running out of time because for every second you spend, that's exponentially increased back on Earth, and the chances of saving are sort of in this clicking time bomb of a movie. But every sort of Christopher Nolan movie, not to diminish it because they're really entertaining and exciting and really well crafted in terms of a technical level, but a lot of the Christopher Nolan movies have the sort of man on a mission with a singular goal, with great tense intercutting, with a propulsive Hans Zimmer score, of which this also has. But reason why I think Interstellar is one of the best sci-fi movies of the decade is not only for that technical expertise, but also the emotional connection and how it uses space and sort of the expansiveness of world as a way to reflect back on sort of more human themes, which is not an uncommon theme for science fiction movies, but I think really does well and worked within Christopher Nolan's kind of commitment to realism and reality and keeping things sort of grounded. That whatever it is, even if it's Batman, even if it's a superhero movie, it definitely feels sort of that grounded element as well. So by setting up and interweaving the theme of hope, of a reason to fight for the future, of what makes us more human than sort of unconditional love we have for our family members, of the perilousness of time with actually something tangible, by taking these themes that are so grand, but actually sort of relaying them back to something that's much more human and much more understandable, that we can talk about time and reality and relativity and all these things, but ultimately what's making us do these things, what's making us explore those edges, why do we keep on coming back? And it's because of things that make us human, the human connection. This one, in this movie, realized as a father-daughter connection. By spending that first hour with bonding between Murph and Cooper and being able to have that connection, it makes it feel real, it makes it feel human, it makes the consequences feel tangible and understandable and relatable, and therefore incredibly emotional. And one of the most emotional scenes, in terms of just being an exhausting kind of a moment, I won't spoil it, but it's when, if you've seen the movie, you know it's when Matthew McConaughey is sort of looking at a screen and he just sort of breaks down, he starts bawling. And I think about that often, of, in a way, just what would I do, or what's the sort of response, or how would that feel in terms of just an empathy kind of a way. But also, it's just a devastating kind of sci-fi topic. And then, but really the reason why, even though it's set in space, even though it's this grand thing, and they're just using space and time and the sci-fi genre as a way to reflect back onto and change the way we sort of look at our relationships with the ones we love. My number 3 pick is Guardians of the Galaxy.
They call themselves the Guardians of the Galaxy. What a bunch of a-holes.
Hooked on a feeling, I'm high on believing that you're in love with me.
One of the best discoveries of the decade, a time where the MCU had sort of their streak going. They had all their individual hero movies with their recognizable characters, then it all leads up to Avengers, but now what? Now they have to create new characters. They have to get more people from the comic books and get more people in and really sort of entrust that when you see Marvel, you think of quality or think of trust or you think of interconnection with the universe, and that this was really a time where if they screwed it up, then people would really be hesitant to accepting new characters that they introduce. But they didn't screw up, and they gave us one of the most entertaining, funny, and exciting movies of the decade, which is Guardians of the Galaxy. So I remember walking into it for the very first time and just being totally blown away because I had no expectations. I was like, what are these Guardians guys? What do they do? And then walking away and loving every single one of these characters, which I think is actually the appeal of the movie, is that it's almost kind of like a hangout movie. It's the reason why you rewatch and why you come back to them are these characters. You just want to be around them, you just want to hang out with them. And really, we never had any sort of attachment to any of these other actors or these characters, so that we were able to discover them for the first time. So we have, of course, Chris Pratt as Star-Lord, being the prototypical cocky, self-confident hero, but also have that meta element of wanting to be a hero, but not actually maybe having the skills just yet, and having that sort of meta commentary aspect that is typical with sort of comedy throughout this decade. Then Rocket and Groot, the oddest couple since The Odd Couple. You have the large physical presence of Groot, but then his sort of calming, tame voice, and then you have Rocket Raccoon, played by Bradley Cooper, which is the sort of more opposite, much smaller, neurotic, anxious, yet he's actually the leader because he knows what's best, and sort of the kind of a smuggler and kind of a guy who's living on the edges and a criminal, but definitely one that is just trying to survive. Zoe Saldana as Gamora, as the sort of really intense, serious, kick-ass, really proficient and exciting, and definitely the most skilled out of the group, but still sort of needs to learn how to work within a group and know that she can't do everything by herself. And then, of course, the most literal character maybe I've seen on screen, which is Drax. Of course, they milk that to its comedic end, but also by being the most literal character, he's always expressing his feelings, and therefore allows for some really heartfelt moments when he really gets together and bonds with this group. And even though there's sort of these large stereotypes that maybe we've seen before of types of characters, James Gunn really brings a sort of a three-dimensional element to it by exploring them, whether it be their backstories, where they're coming from, which they all sort of have, these sort of really emotionally connective backstories, their ability to connect in sort of their realization that they're all outsiders, and then by grouping together, they're able to group sort of a nice ragtag kind of a group. And I think that's a testament to the characters that, of course, were written in the comic books, but then, of course, adapted by James Gunn and really given a voice. And so many people realize the Guardians of the Galaxy as the movies. And, of course, the second one, which I also really enjoyed. I even talk about the sort of the bright neon visuals that are so colorful. And now that we're in MCU, we're in space, we're able to do all these different types of settings and new worlds, which are so exciting. And I didn't even mention the, of course, great soundtrack, which is maybe the signature elements of the film, which are so pitch perfect in every little moment and every scene that they belong to, but then, of course, contribute to the overall tone of this great space action adventure, which is funny. You keep coming back because of these characters. It's a movie I'd recommend to a lot of people, and it's just something that makes me happy every time I watch it. Then my number 2 pick is another MCU movie, my favorite movie of last year of 2019, and maybe one of my favorite movies of the decade. That's going to be Avengers Endgame.
We lost friends. We lost family. We lost a part of ourselves. This is the fight of our lives.
This is gonna work, Steve.
I know it is. Because I don't know what I'm going to do if it doesn't.
An epic superhero movie and the chronicle end to a franchise of dominance, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which not only dominated the box office and the critical and commercial sort of pop culture relevance, it also dominated, I think, in terms of its quality. Very few sci-fi franchises like this had so many great movies within them. And I talked about Captain America: Civil War in my action video. This is 3 sci-fi movies that have MCU movies that have made the sci-fi list, all which are very sort of sci-fi and space heavy. Avengers Endgame actually was able to end this saga and look forward to the future, something that is incredibly difficult task, and highlighted even more by the, you could argue, failures of some of the other endings we had in the same year. 2019 was also the year of the Game of Thrones ending, where people were very sort of divisive and didn't appreciate sort of the rushed ending, we'll say, of that last season. Or the ending of the 3rd Star Wars movie in this sort of reboot trilogy, where people realized that maybe there wasn't a plan, but the Marvel Cinematic Universe is kind of quite the different opposite. It's the one with a plan, the one that has all these interconnecting things and all these loose ends, but then Avengers Endgame creating a clever and smart way to create and end all those loose ends and create a satisfying and kind of a journey of this part of the MCU. But I actually think Avengers Endgame is more than that. It's not just a movie that is the final conclusion and one big action sequence. It's a superhero epic, and in that first hour, they really allow a sense of grief to hang over the film and actually explore that as a theme. That the consequences of the last film were not just pushed to the side in the first 10 minutes. In a way, they kind of were, but those effects still happened. Half the universe was wiped out of existence. Everyone was affected by this, and it's just a way and a process of grieving of the people who are left. We see all these different superheroes and the different ways they sort of go into that, whether it be Black Widow and her sort of commitment to work, or Chris Evans, Captain America, who just commits into sort of trying to help others and try to keep his emotions out through sort of therapy and things like that, and group sessions. But then also something like Hawkeye, who goes and becomes a revenge-killing machine. And that sort of is an interesting element. I think that I'd put this personally, and maybe this is a large statement, but up there with movies like Margaret or Manchester by the Sea or Hereditary, in terms of trying to explore grief and how people go through that, and what are sort of the ways people cope with that, and is there a way to get over that. But then, of course, what Avengers does is now in the second hour, where we potentially find a way to save these guys, it becomes a really great way to honor the previous movies. It now becomes very self-reflexive. Now we're sort of going through, and without spoiling anything, sort of, even though it's one of the biggest movies of the decade, I think it's number 2 behind Star Wars: The Force Awakens, adjusted for inflation. But we now go back and sort of are able to reflect on a lot of things and how all the things interconnected and worked back here. I also appreciated how they now really, because of the snap, they are able to reduce their amount of characters. So the first 2 hours of the movie, it's not, we have to do 5 minutes with Black Panther, then 5 minutes with Captain America, and therefore we get no attention to anybody. We have our group of characters that we stuck with since the first Avengers, and they get their due and they get their time. So that when the third sort of final act, the final hour comes and we have this epic battle, it's incredibly rewarding and engaging and enthralling. And I think those sort of, the balance of those 3 acts are why I keep coming back to it, is because it's not just this big final 1 hour fight, or it's just a self-reflexive way to tie up loose ends, or just a thing about an examination on grief. It's all 3 of those things. It's an epic movie in all senses of the word, and the balance that the Russo brothers were able to do is just incredible. I mean, just even that final battle sequence where there's so many heroes, and the choreography with the camera, with how all the people, and sort of the pacing of it, of how there's times of great action and times of sort of reflection and of coming back up, and sort of the ups and downs of it all. And the Avengers Endgame may be one of my favorite movie theater experiences, at least of movies that came out this decade, of the decade. I think a lot of people really relate to and fight for the movie theater experience because it's an experience unlike any other. It's a total communal experience, and that was the experience I had while watching Avengers Endgame. When that final sort of hour happens and that final fight happens, we get the clapping and the cheering and the crying and the just overwhelming amount of emotions and connection and communal experience that everyone has. There's an energy that's so hard to describe and elevate the movie so much for me, and that even though it's a movie I saw 4 times in theaters and I also have seen it now on home video, it's still, it still works on home video, but there's still nothing like that initial first experience, which may be coloring my viewing. Maybe you didn't have that viewing. I tried to, of course, remove that, but I'm still really thankful for Avengers Endgame for gifting me that kind of experience, one that I will never forget. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. I want to know your favorite movies of the decade, just in general. Maybe your favorite sci-fi fantasy movies of the decade. Were you surprised that I've left a couple things off? What's your prediction for my #1 sci-fi movie? There's a couple that maybe you're thinking about that could be on there, so interested to see some of your thoughts. That's about it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.